The quiet clinking of crystal flutes, the soft hum of live violin strings, and the subtle scent of expensive perfume filled the room, but none of it could drown out the harsh sound of tearing cotton. I stood frozen in the middle of the dining room at Le Mirage, one of Manhattan's most exclusive rooftop restaurants, as a cold draft hit my exposed arm. The sleeve of my crisp white server shirt was ripped wide open, exposing my skin to 50 pairs of staring eyes. Right in front of me stood Victoria Vance, a prominent socialite dressed in a fiery red Marisa gown that practically screamed for attention. Her manicured hand, heavy with diamond rings, was extended out, pointing directly at my face as her high, shrill laughter bounced off the polished oak paneling. "Look at her," Victoria shrieked, her voice dripping with pure venom as she turned to her wealthy friends seated at table 7. "Look at this pathetic little creature. She can't even hold a serving tray without looking like a gutter rat." Her fiancé, a sleek corporate executive named Julian Vance, leaned back in his leather chair, a glass of vintage Pinot Noir in his hand, chuckling along with her. Beside them, another high society couple joined in the laughter, holding their hands over their mouths as if the sight of a struggling waitress was the funniest entertainment they had seen all year. I held the heavy brass tray tightly with both hands, my fingers trembling against the polished metal. On it sat a glass of iced water and a plate of half-eaten truffle risotto that Victoria had deliberately shoved off her table seconds before grabbing my shoulder and tearing my uniform. The mess had splattered across my black apron, grease soaking through the fabric, but I didn't drop the tray. I couldn't. Tears burned behind my eyelids, stinging hot against my cheeks as I lowered my head, my dark hair falling loose around my face to hide the raw humiliation burning through me. To Victoria Vance, to Julian, and to every snobbish billionaire in this room, I was just Clara, an invisible 26-year-old waitress making minimum wage, desperate enough to swallow any insult just to keep her job. They had no idea that my full name was Clara Sterling. They had no idea that I didn't work for Le Mirage. I owned it. In fact, I owned the entire Sterling Hospitality Group, a multi-billion-dollar empire that encompassed 40 luxury hotels and Michelin-starred establishments across the globe. 5 weeks ago, my father, Richard Sterling, passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving me as the sole heir to his vast enterprise. I was 26, holding a master's degree in business administration from Columbia, but my father had always taught me one fundamental principle: a leader who doesn't understand the ground floor will eventually collapse from the roof down. Before stepping into the boardroom as the official chief executive officer, I decided to go undercover in my own flagship restaurant. I wanted to see how my staff was treated, how the managers operated, and whether the values my father built were being upheld when no executives were watching. I took off my designer watch, put on a generic server uniform, tied my hair into a messy bun, and signed up under my mother's maiden name as a part-time waitress. For 4 weeks, I mopped floors, scrubbed counters, carried heavy trays, and swallowed my pride. I saw the quiet dedication of the kitchen staff, the exhaustion of the line cooks, and the subtle, cruel entitlement of Manhattan's elite, but nothing prepared me for the systematic cruelty of Victoria Vance. Victoria was the daughter of Robert Vance, a high-profile real estate tycoon who was currently seeking a $50 million investment from the Sterling Group to bail out his failing commercial properties. Victoria didn't know that the fate of her family's wealth hinged on a contract sitting on my executive desk upstairs. She only knew that she felt powerful whenever she made someone else feel small. The tension in the room grew thicker as Victoria's laughter finally began to fade into a cruel, mocking sneer. She took a deliberate step closer to me, the sharp heel of her red Christian Louboutin pumps clicking sharply against the marble floor. The scent of her expensive Rose de Mai perfume invaded my space, thick and suffocating. "What's the matter, little waitress?" Victoria taunted, her voice carrying across the silent dining room. "Are you going to cry, or are you going to apologize for ruining my appetite with your ugly presence?" "I didn't ruin your appetite, Miss Vance," I said, keeping my voice low and measured, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "You purposely knocked the plate off the table, and when I reached down to clean it up, you grabbed my shirt." A sudden gasp went through the surrounding tables. In a world built on fake pleasantries and unearned authority, a waitress talking back was an unpardonable sin. Victoria's blue eyes flashed with sudden, terrifying rage. Her smile disappeared, replaced by a contorted mask of pure fury. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she spat out, leaning in so close I could see the fine lines of powdered makeup around her nose. "You are nobody. You are a piece of dirt on the bottom of my shoe. Do you know who my father is? Do you know how much money my family spends in this place?" "Victoria, darling, calm down," Julian said smoothly, standing up from his chair and adjusting his bespoke navy suit. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and boredom. "Just call the general manager. Have this useless girl fired on the spot and blacklisted from every establishment in the city. She clearly doesn't know her place." "You're right," Victoria hissed, never breaking eye contact with me. "Where is the manager? Where is Arthur?" Within seconds, the heavy double doors of the kitchen swung open, and Arthur Pendleton, the general manager of Mirage, came hurrying down the aisle. Arthur was a sharp-featured man in his late 40s, wearing a tailored black suit that cost $3,000, paid for by my company's payroll. He prided himself on catering to the ultra-wealthy, often turning a blind eye to how his lower-level staff were treated as long as the VIP tables left generous tips and glowing reviews. When Arthur saw the scene, the torn uniform, the spilled food on the tray, and the enraged Victoria Vance, his face turned pale, then flushed a dark, furious red. But his anger wasn't directed at Victoria. It was directed entirely at me. "What on earth is going on here?" Arthur demanded, stepping between me and Victoria, bowing his head slightly toward her in a disgusting display of subservience. "Miss Vance, I am so deeply sorry. Please, accept my humblest apologies for this disturbance." "Your waitress is an insolent brat, Arthur," Victoria declared, folding her arms across her chest and glaring at me. "She spilled food near my table. Talked back to me when I pointed it out, and then had the nerve to argue. Look at her. She looks like a street beggar, and she has completely ruined our anniversary dinner." Arthur turned on me, his eyes wide with hostility. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look at the torn sleeve on my arm or the bruised skin underneath where Victoria had grabbed me. He saw a temporary waitress and a billionaire heiress, and to a man like Arthur, the math was simple. "Clara, drop that tray right now and get out of this dining room," Arthur barked, his voice ringing across the quiet restaurant. "You are officially terminated. Hand in your apron to human resources and don't expect a single cent for your hours this week." I stood my ground, my posture slowly straightening. The tears that had stunk my eyes moments ago had completely dried up, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that settled deep into my bones. "Arthur," I said quietly, using his first name instead of the required, Mr. Pendleton. "You haven't even asked for my side of the story. There are security cameras above table 7. You can easily check the footage before making a decision." Arthur looked at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. How dare a minimum-wage dishwasher tell him how to run his floor? "I don't need to check any cameras," Arthur yelled, his voice rising in panic as he tried to protect his relationship with the Vance family. "Miss Vance is a valued patron of Le Mirage. Her word is worth 10 times more than anything that comes out of your mouth. You are fired. Do you hear me? Get out before I have security escort you out in handcuffs." Victoria let out another smug laugh, looking at Julian with a look of absolute victory. "That's more like it, Arthur. Make sure she's thrown out into the alley where she belongs." I looked at Arthur. I looked at Victoria Vance. I looked at Julian, who was sipping his wine with a satisfied smirk, and then I scanned the faces of the other diners. Some looked away in shame, but most watched the spectacle with amused indifference. Not a single person had stood up for the waitress. Not a single person had asked if I was okay. In that single, devastating moment, the dark reality of my father's empire hit me. He had built an establishment of luxury and refinement, but beneath the shiny surface, it was rotten with corruption, cruelty, and cowardice. A quiet calmness washed over me. The dark moment was over. The undercover experiment was finished. I set the brass tray down on an empty side table with a slow, deliberate sound. I didn't rush. I didn't shrink. I reached down, untied the black apron from around my waist, and folded it neatly, placing it right beside the soiled plate. Then I reached into the front pocket of my apron and pulled out a small, sleek black leather card holder, my personal wallet, which I had kept hidden all evening. Arthur frowned, watching me with growing irritation. "What are you doing? I told you to leave." I ignored him completely. I opened the card holder, pulled out a gold-embossed executive keycard and a platinum signet ring bearing the crest of the Sterling Hospitality Group, the ring my father had given me on my 21st birthday. I slipped the ring onto my right index finger, the polished gold gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. Then I looked Arthur dead in the eye. My posture shifted completely. The slouched, timid stance of a struggling waitress vanished, replaced by the commanding, effortless authority of a woman who had been raised to rule empires. "Arthur," I said, my voice no longer soft or pleading, but ringing with a crystal-clear, icy authority that caused every person within 10 feet to freeze. "You have 5 seconds to call Harrison Vance from the executive suite upstairs and tell him to get down here immediately." Arthur blinked, taken aback by the sudden change in my tone. "What? Who? Who do you think you are talking to?" "I am talking to my employee," I replied calmly. Victoria burst into another loud laugh, though it sounded slightly more forced this time. "Oh, this is priceless. The delusional little server thinks she can give orders now. Arthur, why are you still letting her stand here?" Before Arthur could reply, the heavy private elevator doors at the back of the dining room chimed softly. Out stepped Harrison Vance, the senior vice president of corporate operations for the Sterling Group, accompanied by 2 high-ranking legal advisors. Harrison was my father's right-hand man and the man currently overseeing the day-to-day corporate affairs until my official public unveiling scheduled for next week. Harrison had been upstairs in the private suite finalizing corporate audits. He glanced over at the commotion near table 7, his sharp eyes instantly scanning the crowd. When his eyes landed on me, standing in a torn uniform shirt, holding an executive keycard, with my father's signet ring gleaming on my hand, his face went completely white. He dropped the leather portfolio he was holding, the papers scattering across the polished floor. "Mr. Vance," Arthur called out, rushing forward with a nervous smile, completely unaware of the horror unfolding in Harrison's mind. "Mr. Vance, I apologize for this ugly scene. We had a temporary server cause a disturbance at Miss Victoria's table, but I've already handled it. I'm having her removed immediately." Harrison didn't even look at Arthur. He shoved the general manager aside with such force that Arthur stumbled into a chair. Harrison walked briskly toward me, his hands trembling slightly, his forehead glistening with a sudden layer of cold sweat. He stopped precisely 2 feet away, bowed his head deeply, and spoke in a voice that echoed clearly across the silent restaurant. "Miss Sterling," Harrison said, his voice quivering with absolute reverence. We were expecting you in the boardroom at 9. What happened to your uniform? Are you all right?" The entire room seemed to lose its oxygen in a single, unified breath. Arthur's mouth fell open, his eyes bulging as he stared at Harrison, then at me. Miss Sterling," he stammered, his voice dropping an octave. "Harrison, what are you talking about? She's Clara, the new part-time server." "Shut up, you fool." Harrison turned on Arthur, his voice shaking with pure rage. "This is Clara Sterling, daughter of Richard Sterling and the new chief executive officer and sole owner of the Sterling Hospitality Group." A collective, violent shockwave crashed through the ballroom. Victoria Vance froze mid-stride, her face draining of all color until she looked as white as the linen tablecloths. The hand she had been using to point at me dropped limp to her side. Her fiancé, Julian, accidentally knocked his wine glass over, the dark red liquid spilling across the table like blood, but nobody looked at it. All eyes were locked on me. "No," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking as her arrogant facade shattered into a million tiny pieces. "No, that's impossible. She's a waitress." I took a step forward, The luxury heels I wasn't wearing making no difference as my presence dominated the entire room. I looked at Victoria Vance, watching the sudden, paralyzing terror take root in her eyes. "I decided to work undercover in my own restaurant for a month, Miss Vance," I said, my voice calm, steady, and utterly ruthless. "I wanted to see how my business was run. I wanted to see how my managers treated their staff, and I wanted to see how our esteemed guests treated the people who serve them." I turned my gaze to Arthur, who looked like he was about to suffer a heart attack right there on the dining room floor. His knees were shaking so violently, he had to hold onto the edge of a service station to stay upright. "Arthur," I said softly. "Miss Sterling, please," Arthur gasped, sweat pouring down his face as he fell to his knees right in front of me. "I didn't know, I swear to God I didn't know it was you, if I had known." "That is precisely the problem, Arthur," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his frantic babbling like a razor blade. "You only respect people when you think they have power over you. You don't care about truth, you don't care about justice, and you certainly don't care about human decency. You fired a worker without a second thought just to lick the boots of a wealthy bully." "Miss Sterling, I have a family. I've worked here for 10 years, Arthur sobbed, his head pressed almost against the floor. "And your tenure ends tonight," I declared cold-bloodedly. "You are terminated from the Sterling Hospitality Group, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am initiating a full corporate audit into your management practices. If I find a single instance of wage theft or staff mistreatment under your watch, our legal team will sue you into personal bankruptcy." Harrison immediately motioned to the 2 security guards standing near the elevator. "Escort Mr. Pendleton out of the building immediately. He is banned from all Sterling properties." Arthur was dragged away, weeping and begging for mercy, his pathetic cries fatting down the hallway. Then I turned my attention back to table 7. Victoria Vance was standing completely rigid, her hands trembling as she looked at me. She knew what was coming. Her father's company, Vance Real Estate, was hours away from insolvency, relying entirely on the $50 million credit line that only one person in the world could approve. "Miss Sterling," Victoria began, her shrill, loud voice now reduced to a pathetic, desperate squeak. I am so sorry. I didn't mean, it was a misunderstanding." I was stressed. "A misunderstanding?" I asked, raising one eyebrow as I looked down at my torn shirt. "You ripped my clothes. You publicly humiliated me. You called me a gutter rat and demanded I be thrown into the alley." Julian quickly stepped forward, putting his hands up in a defensive gesture, completely abandoning his fiancée to save his own skin. "Miss Sterling, please, I had nothing to do with this. It was all Victoria. She's always had a terrible temper." I tried to calm her down. Victoria turned on Julian, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Julian, how could you?" "Shut up, Victoria," Julian hissed, turning back to me with a groveling, desperate smile. "Miss Sterling, I am a senior director at Blackwood Capital. We can work together. I will personally apologize for her behavior." "Save your breath, Mr. Vance," I said coldly. "Harrison." "Yes, Miss Sterling," Harrison answered instantly. "Call our legal team immediately," I ordered, looking directly into Victoria's terrified eyes. "Cancel the $50 million investment line for Vance Real Estate. Terminate all vendor contracts associated with the Vance family across all 40 of our hotels worldwide. And instruct our media team to release the full security footage of Table 7 from tonight to every major news outlet in New York." Victoria let out a strangled, horrified scream. "No, please, that will destroy my father's company. We will lose everything. Please, I beg you." She collapsed to her knees, reaching out to grab the hem of my apron lying on the table, tears streaming down her face, ruining her heavy makeup. The exact same woman who had been pointing and laughing at my misery 5 minutes ago was now sobbing on the floor, begging for a scrap of mercy from the waitress she had tried to ruin. "You told me earlier that I couldn't buy decency, Miss Vance," I said, leaning down slightly so only she could hear my final words. "You were right, but power is something I was born with, and you just learned what happens when you abuse it." I turned my back on her, refusing to give her another second of my time. "Harrison," I said, walking toward the private elevator as the entire dining room stood in breathless silence. "Gather the entire kitchen and service staff in the executive lounge. I want to double their pay, fix their shift schedules, and personally apologize for how this place has been run." "Right away, CEO Sterling," Harrison replied with a proud, sharp nod. As the silver doors of the executive elevator closed, hiding the chaotic, weeping mess of Table 7 from my view, I looked at my reflection in the polished steel panel. The torn shirt was still there, the grease stain was still on my sleeve, but the woman looking back at me was no longer just an heiress trying to figure out her place. I was Clara Sterling, and my empire was going to be built on respect, or it wouldn't be built at all.